Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Susan Deutsch, and I'm the program manager at the Muse Writers Center in Norfolk, Virginia. We are a creative writing nonprofit, and we offer classes and workshops for all genres, age levels, experience levels. So check that out. We also host events like this regularly, as well as partner events in the community. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started, all the work you're going to hear tonight is the author's original work unless otherwise stated, and this is in no way a publication of unpublished works. And now we'll jump into it. So here to introduce our guest tonight is Dana Staves, one of our amazing Muse teachers. She got her MFA from ODU and as a romance author, currently working on a cozy mystery romance from coastal Virginia, from around here, where she lives with her wife, their son, and their very clingy cat. Dana, take it away.
Thank you. And welcome everyone to a reading and Q&A with Joanna Eleftheriou. At the Muse, we witness firsthand that joyful transformation that occurs when somebody finds their voice on the page, no matter what the genre. And as Joanna and I prepared for this event, we found ourselves returning to that notion of joy, of celebration, and where those feelings and experiences fit into a writer's life, or perhaps the writing life. Those will be the guiding ideas behind tonight's event. And for the event, we are honored to have Joanna with us. Dr. Joanna Eleftheriou holds a degree in English from Cornell, an MFA in nonfiction from Old Dominion University, and her doctorate from the University of Missouri. She may have specialized in nonfiction, but Joanna has published poetry, fiction, book reviews, and more. She is a professor at Christopher Newport University and Newport News. Joanna is an exuberant student of life, with an eye for detail and thoughtful questions for all occasions. To spend time with Joanna is to be welcomed into a discussion that is always about something bigger. She was also one of my first roommates after I moved to Virginia, so this is especially lovely to be introducing her tonight. Her first book, This Way Back, was many years in the making, and in it, Joanna casts an unflinching eye towards her homeland, her sexuality, her family, and her identity. She is currently working on her second book, which is about fun. And on that note, let the fun begin.
Thank you so much, Dana. It's truly an honor and a pleasure and a delight to be here. Thank you, Susan, and to the Muse for hosting me for this virtual event, even at a time when I know that everybody has been watching a lot of virtual events, but I'm really, really grateful to everybody who's here on the Zoom and watching in the future. I'm going to read an essay that comes about midway through the book, a little bit of an essay that comes about midway through the book, and it's called Dancing Greek. I am going again to Greece. Going back is a phrase that applies, if not because my mother's roots on the Greek mainland make it a kind of homeland for me, then because this June 2014 trip marks the fourth consecutive summer for which I'll be flying to Greece to teach. I call it the best job in the world, and yes, it's enviable. That's not in the book. I'll spend 1 week in the northern city of Thessaloniki and 3 on the island of Thasos, a Balkan place with gray stone rooftops and steep pine-covered hills that reach down to a rocky, windswept coast. Thasos lies in the sea, the poet Archilochos wrote, like the backbone of an ass. Its quarries supplied marble for the sculptures that populate museums from the Louvre and the Met. Flatbed trucks still carry enormous marble slabs on ferries to the mainland. And walking along the island's marble-strewn paths feels a bit like walking through a fancy courthouse or a church. Leaving for my job at the writing workshops in Greece is a summer ritual for me now. Each June, I leave behind Joanna, my Cypriot American self, and become Joanna, the Greek teacher. Swinging between badly paid jobs in Cyprus, Greece, and the United States, as it has so far, my life has had little room for travel to countries other than these 3. After college, I joined an English friend of mine for a month-long Eurorail adventure from Cali to Bari, but that's about it. By limiting my last 13 years of travel to the 3 countries in whose languages I'm fluent, I always feel at least partly that I belong. And I forget what it feels like to hear a buzz of foreignness around me. I choose flights with long layovers in cities where I've never lived: Paris, Munich, Amsterdam, Istanbul. And I steal out of the airport for a few hours so that I can listen to a language I do not understand. For this is how our American students feel during their 4 weeks in Greece. Sure, I'll teach them all the Greek I can, and they will study hard and learn enough to order food and ask for directions from patient waiters and eager salespeople. But the rapid everyday conversations around them will remain an unintelligible buzz, and the buzz will tell them, you are not at home. My flight into Thessaloniki lands at 10 o'clock at night, and though in the past I've made a show of my thrift by taking the city bus, this time I hop into one of the taxis waiting for all 3 workshop participants who came in on my flight. I serve as interpreter as the driver asks people where they're from, and I field further questions about what one group of Americans is doing in Thessaloniki. Soon, the tall man driving the taxi looks into the rearview mirror and asks, "You're Cypriot, huh?" The near instant recognition is my favorite thing about being in Greece. Yeah, I say, with enthusiasm at being correctly assessed, and smile eagerly at the back of the driver's long gray ponytail. In Greece, whether I ask a gas station attendant to fill up the tank or a kiosk owner how much a pack of gum costs, I'm always recognized as a Cypriot. In Cyprus, frequently I'll get a few sentences into a conversation and then my accent will provoke the assessment, Anglo-Kiprea, British Cypriot. I say, no, I'm American. Often the other Cypriot shrugs as if to say, same difference. It's British Cypriots who are familiar to them, not Americans. So that's what they decide I am. In Greece, on the other hand, the Cypriotness of my Greek accent tends to mask any inflections that come from being a native speaker of English. And I am read as native. I pass. After the taxis have dropped us off at the El Greco Hotel, Christopher, the director of the workshop this year, meets me in the lobby and suggests I dump my suitcase in my room and come out for an ouzo right away. I equivocate. I need a few more hours to gradually transform. Once I become my Greek teacher self, I will feel like I'm under obligation to have fun, to drink and dance regardless of my mood. Once at the hotel tavern at which the workshop is anchored, I had been dancing for a few hours and I went to sit down. Dasos, the owner, who's about my age, yelled at me, "Don't sit. If you sit down, everyone will stop dancing." I believed him and have since then always felt an obligation to have fun for the sake of those who've paid for an experience in Greece. When I get to my room, Erica is there waiting for me. Now that I've moved to the US and she lives in Cyprus, we can't spend time together like we did in high school in the years between college and grad school, so I've invited her to come to Greece and share my room. I feel like I have only one night to catch up, just the two of us, before our social circle widens to include the other faculty and workshop participants. 2 decades into our friendship, Erica and I maintain a common, secluded space bound tightly by our common high school experience in Cyprus, our bilingualism, our common interests in science and literature and liberation, common friends and common histories of trouble and joy. I envy the way she lived in Cyprus her whole life, except for college, so she can grasp nuances in Greek and Greek-Cypriot that I miss. She also code switches between Greek and Cypriot pronunciation so that, bizarrely, people's first guess is that I'm the Cypriot and she's the one from Greece, even though I'm the one with family roots on the Greek mainland. Once we get to Thasos, though, we'll both just be the Cypriot girls. We don't have to introduce ourselves. People talk about us, compare notes, remember us from the last year. The ice cream truck owner says, the Cypriot girls are back, and promises to put in an order for my favorite popsicle. Neither Erica nor I have a Greek cell phone, but we find that the neighbor network serves just as well. I walk into the mini mart and ask, did the other Cypriot woman buy eggs today? Yogurt? I'm going to skip a little bit ahead so that we get to the island of Thasos. On Tuesday, we make our way to the island of Thasos. At a rest stop on our bus trip eastward from Thessaloniki, the soups and sweets are labeled in Turkish as well as Greek. There's a ferry boat and more road, and then we reach the Archondisa Tavern and Hotel, which will host us for 3 weeks. Christopher has known our host for decades, while the other teachers, Natalie Bakopoulos, the fiction writer, and Carolyn Forshey, the poet, are returning for a 3rd year, just as I am. 3 summers, 3 month-long stays have been enough time to develop in us a strong affection for our host family, and we greet them with hearty emotions of distant but enthusiastic relatives. Stamatis Kouzis, deeply beloved to us all, is a fisherman who told me he built the Archondisa cinder block by cinder block with his own hands. He supplies the tavern with fish now, and has told me that he built and worked for the tavern for decades for the purpose of supporting his family until he could have the life he wanted, which is the life he has now as a fisherman whose sale of fish barely even pays for the fishing boat's gasoline. His wife, Eva, runs the small hotel attached to the tavern and also governs the kitchen. Tassos, who will inherit the restaurant from his parents, Stamatis and Eva, is my age. He's in charge of the wood oven that's advertised on the billboard on the road, shoveling in loaves of bread and ceramic pots of food his mother and her workers have prepared. These people will shock the American students with their warmth and with hospitality that to the Greeks feels just like basic decency, and to the Americans as an overflowing generosity. As I begin our first class on the island, I ask if they have any urgent questions. They do. How can we hang out with Tassos every night without getting shit-faced? I explain my trick for dealing with hospitality requirement that the hosts keep filling up each other's the guest glasses. I try to illuminate the way individual wishes in Greece are subordinated to the demands of the group, the pareia, such that their personal desire to drink more or stop drinking doesn't matter. Each member of a pareia must at least appear to be drinking for as long as everyone else is. Accept that your glass will always be full, I suggest, no matter how much or how little you drink. Also, I remind them that when their glasses are filled, the house filled on the house because the owner's cultural urge towards hospitality, they've already paid in a sense because the cost of the meals is substantial. In fact, after Tassos spends a night giving the students wine for free, he would be frustrated if they didn't order meals from him in return. I avoid these awkward misunderstandings by cooking meals in my apartment and celebrate my decision to live the rest of my life in individualistic America, where I rarely get into such scrapes. So far, no one has done me unsolicited favors and then asked me for payback. Teaching others how to navigate the emotionally charged and complicated Greek social structure brings me relief. I don't expect it to happen, but it does. I'm just aware at first of being so happy to be doing this work and just marveling at my good luck, being paid to be doing something so therapeutic. Later, with reflection, I consider the way that teaching Americans to decode Greek interactions and unspoken systems of reciprocity and navigate a minefield, which it's impossible to navigate without insulting someone, normalizes my own difficulty and eases the stress of being so often unsure how to act, the stress of not knowing what exactly is expected of me, because my 11 years in Cyprus aren't the same as a whole lifetime. And my Greek-speaking parents aren't the same as parents who never left. The same problem of not quite belonging follows me into American contexts. Greek music is the only music I know, and when my American friends sing or discuss music, I can't participate. English literature in all its high and low forms is beloved to me, but when it comes to music, I only listen to Greek music. Erica, whose family level closeness entitles her to say this, attributes my Greek-only attitude with music to stubbornness. Other people just think I'm strange. But it makes sense to me. The only music that sounds to me like belonging is Greek. I take a special and enormous pleasure at the opportunities to dance to Greek music that my island job affords. This year, Christopher has told me on our bus ride to Tassos, I'll have a special opportunity. The German dancers we've heard about will have lessons concurrent with our workshops. Our first night on Tassos, we meet the Greek dance teachers, Nikos and Bambis, who is happy to joke about the implications of his name when said in English. It's a typical mainland Greece shortening of Charalambos, but it's unfamiliar to us. Bambi thinks Bambos, which is a Cypriot abbreviation of the name, sounds silly, and will continue during the coming weeks to poke friendly fun at what he picks up of the Cypriot dialect Erica and I use with one another. and I'll stop there.
Awesome. Sorry, took me a second to unmute. So that, thank you for that reading. It's so fun, I think, as I read through the book and then actually getting to hear you read it is just always a pleasure. So I think I want to start kind of in sort of a broader general kind of mind frame. And, as we were talking about our idea of how to frame your reading and your Q&A as a study of celebration or fun or joy, I would love to know, what is your earliest or most significant memory of writing as something that was fun or pleasurable?
That's a great question. One early memory I have is that when I was 6 years old, I started making a book, and we got the cover going with construction paper and glitter glue. It may be the only time I've ever used glitter glue, and that was exciting. But then I got stuck. I didn't continue writing the book. I just made the cover, and I don't have any other recollections. And I guess telling stories seemed like such an adventure because I didn't know what was going to happen. Because I wrote a little bit of fiction when I was a kid, and I don't really have memories of this in my mind, but I have sort of remnants in like an archive of, I used to take a notebook and like scribble stories before I knew the alphabet. Mm-hmm. And I realized that it didn't occur to me that I could tell my dolls stories. I had to write them first. And what I do remember is I didn't really think there was a big difference between my scribbling and what all the grown-ups were doing with letters. I just figured like kind of the letters were some like extra sort of icing on the cake that you learned when you went to school. But like my scribbling was
completely sufficient.
Yeah. It was like, it was basically the same thing.
Yeah, I think so often that we sit in this sort of like writing is hard space, which is fair because like writing is hard. It's just like so much work. But it's also a joy. And I think I would love to know kind of where that joy place resides in your writing.
I'm thinking about your questions and your focus. I thought about how my book opens with a funeral.
Yes.
And it ends with meditations on mourning as well. And something that I love about Greek music, which as I just read, is something I continue stubbornly, according to my high school childhood best friend. What I love about it is that there's a lot of grieving, and I take joy in grieving. I strongly resist it's almost a trope or a habit that happens in a lot of literary readings, where writers apologize for their work being depressing or sad. I absolutely refuse to do that. And at the risk of sounding like I'm criticizing or judging something that comes, so naturally to so many of our friends, and with respect to them, I feel like the trope and sort of it's almost like it's becoming a custom to apologize for sad or depressing writing. And for me, it's joyful to be able to share grief, to be able to share and celebrate with one another the fact that we are able to communalize loss and sadness. I deeply believe in this, and I've done a little bit of research on it, and I found a theory about ancient Greek tragedy, which, they had the ancient Greek tragedians, they had, I don't know how they lasted all day, but they would watch 3 tragedies where everybody dies in the end, and then the sort of nightcap was a comedy, like sort of as a dessert. And a lot of it is about military losses and violence. And a lot of the spectators were veterans because the Greeks were always at war, in case people have forgotten, and just think about the great buildings and literature they made. So there's this theory by Brian Dories that the communalizing of loss, grief, and trauma that happens in those tragedies was the reason why the traumatized soldiers didn't suffer PTSD. This is my personal theory. I have zero credit. I think I took one undergrad psychology course, but I still strongly believe that the way we make a potentially traumatic event not actually traumatize us is communalizing, finding a relational home for loss. And I believe that by singing joyfully, even about our losses, even about what is devastating, we can experience such profound connection with one another in the most intimate and, for many, ineffable and inexpressible feelings of pain. People talk about pain not having language, not being expressible, but I say art makes it possible to connect through our pain, and that intimacy and connection with others through unspeakable pain is the absolute greatest joy.
That's a great answer. And brings me to a follow-on question. So later in your essay, Dancing Greek, you mention that you're reading about mirror neurons and kinesthetic empathy. And what you were saying there, as far as like making loss and grief and pain a communal experience, kind of, it's on the other side of that kinesthetic empathy. And what I understand that to mean is that we are able to empathize or experience a feeling, a movement by watching people move. So they say that, like, if you are watching someone exercise, you start to feel like you're exercising, and I used to watch So You Think You Can Dance, and I would be like, I feel like I could 100% do that. I can't. There's no way I can do any of that stuff. But it's that idea that, like, if you're in the mix and it's somehow, I don't know, brings about that kind of, that communal sense of pain, but also of joy.
Right.
Yeah.
And that we're not alone.
Yeah. Yeah. And in what would ostensibly be, a lot of time, especially in American culture, loss is lonely. We are, there are some losses that nobody even knows that you have. There's like okay, feed them well, and then back off and leave them alone, and you're left to kind of figure that out. And I'm painting with broad strokes. That's not everybody's experience, but it's different in what you recount in the book. Definitely.
Exactly. And that was what I was trying to position myself as, an American who happens to also have this great fortune to have access to this other culture and the education to recognize what it is about these, for all intents and purposes, sort of primitive, hokey, provincial customs. I'm like, no, there's a lot of wisdom. And we have all experienced the NPR broadcast. It was like some scientist figured out that the villagers or the natives or whatever are not crazy after all. There's a scientific reason that art works.
Wow. The more you know. I do want to take 1 second just to give a little reminder to people in the webinar that you can leave questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom window. Totally up to you. I can keep asking Joanna questions, and I can go all day. But if you have a question, please do chime in, and I'll just keep going until I see something. And so, with that idea of mirror neurons and kinesthetic empathy, You say in your essay that brain scientists are figuring out the mechanisms behind the special relief I receive from communally expressing a song's beauty through dance. And that seems to me so in line with your work on fun, which I hope that you'll talk a little bit about at some point during our webinar here, and how we process pleasure. But it's also intrinsically linked to education, which you talk a lot about in this particular essay, is your role as the teacher. And in my case, it reminded me of my role as a parent. I clap at my daughter and now she's like, and I'm like, you're brilliant. But, do you feel, in what ways, I guess, do you feel like we teach each other fun, we teach each other joy, but we also teach each other loss and pain? I guess, do you have things to say about that?
I have a lot to say, and I will first echo what you told the audience about please offer questions, thoughts. I'm happy to answer anything about process. People have read other essays. I'm not embarrassed. Everything that I put into the book, I'm 100% comfortable talking about, even if it's not related. I'm really excited. Dana is asking me some questions that I haven't gotten a chance to talk about before. So this is really exciting, but I am also really excited to hear any questions that the audience has, even if I've answered them before. I'm sure I can give a new answer. So I decided, so my new book project, which you alluded to, started as a joke because I have the good fortune of being a professor. And professors have access to faculty development grants. Universities offer all faculty, especially junior faculty, money to complete research projects. And this book needed, in terms of what I needed for it, by the time I got a faculty position, a couple of books and a computer, which I already had. So I could never, and you have to ask for $3,000. So I couldn't, and I was like, okay, what would I like a university to pay me to do? Go Greek dancing. So I started making this joke to people that my next book is going to be about Greek dancing and fun, because that's what I want to get the university to pay me to do. And then I started actually thinking about how Greek people have fun and how they talk about leisure and rest. And this goes to what you said about teaching, that Greek people are negotiating, as all people, and what culture does is there's a perpetual negotiation of values, right? We're perpetuating, renegotiating what values most. And in the passage that I read, I talked about the often stressful way in which in Greek culture and all communal cultures, which are idealized in some sort of American common parlance, it's nobody cares what your personal preference is. You should do what's better for the communal sort of mood. And what that means, though, is I've sat in the restaurant that I discussed in the passage from, I swear, noon to 1 a.m., 13 hours of sitting in the same place and just eating and singing, eating and singing, eating and singing. And nobody commented on any time being wasted. And I don't think that 13 hours sitting in the same place, just eating and singing, would have happened in America, has ever happened in America, without some kind of comment on, wow, we spent 13 hours just sitting here. Because in Greek culture, sitting around eating and drinking and dancing and singing builds community, and that's what's valuable, I think. And I started thinking, okay, how do Americans talk about having fun and leisure? And then I realized we are in the midst of a cult of wellness and self-care. And I think that self-care is a way of taking fun and making it work that you're supposed to do, and sure, making it moral. Right. And then, so that's my new book.
That is so exciting. I'm gonna kind of drastically change gears because Madeline has a question. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I've heard that authors or writers write with one particular emotion that is prevalent in their works. Which emotion do you think that this is for you?
Wow, that's a question I haven't been asked before. I sometimes start with anger, but I don't think that my particular sort of genre is well given to anger. So I think it's grief, as we were talking about before, and a sense of loss, but loss and grief. And for me, grieving is communal and is cathartic and is ultimately joyful, as counterintuitive as that sounds. So thank you for offering a question that leads to a somewhat complicated answer.
And I think one of the questions that you and I had talked about that's always a good one to ask for writers is how you go from an idea to the actual essay. So if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, a lot of my essays have resulted because I was able to identify something sort of paradoxical that I didn't understand and I wanted to understand. That's what allows for me, essays to have a sense of movement. When I teach, sometimes you get a text and you're like, there's a narrative here, but it just sort of ends, and it happens with stories. And like, how does it feel like? And people often think that the problem is the ending. And my assessment is it's not the ending. You need to have a beginning that anticipates an ending, but hasn't really figured things out. So I sort of position myself as not being able to figure things out. And the two essays that are exemplary of that process are, I have an essay about carobs, and I honestly just was obsessed with carobs and carob trees, and I didn't know why. So I started just writing and figuring out all the things I knew about carobs and how they're really disappointing if you think they're going to taste like chocolate and stuff like that. And ultimately, I came to a realization that the reason I was obsessed with them has to do weirdly with my anxiety about need. And then there's a movie star who turned into a politician that I had a crush on, and I was obsessed with her and I didn't know why. So I wrote that essay to figure that out. With this, I just actually started with this essay, Dancing Greek. It's very different from the other ones in that I knew it fit all of the themes. I knew that an essay about Thasos and teaching Greek on Thasos and dancing on Thasos would fit the project I was working on, or that I needed to write about it. And I didn't know how, and I didn't know where to start. So I just started writing practically a diary. Like every day I would be like, this is what happened today. And then I kind of printed it out and chose the events that seemed to match, and gradually kind of like built up the ones that matched the essay and got rid of all the today was fun, I went to swimming or whatever that had nothing to do with the themes that started to emerge. So I'm kind of shocked that it worked. I would never have thought that you could write an essay that way, but I've got it. Like, people love it. And it's the one that resonates a lot with Greek Americans who straddle these two cultures, who are asked to sort of represent Greekness. And that ended up being a big theme in it.
When you talk about themes, I think that it's something that, as readers of literature and as we're studying literature, we're, like, okay, what are the themes? And it's easy to pick out in somebody else's work. How do you set about finding the themes, or how do you set about teasing them out in your own writing?
For me, I still rely on other readers, because I insist to students and to maybe emerging writers that you don't really get to pick what you're going to write about in the thematic sense. You can select, I believe, and my personal experience and the experience of a lot of writers I know, you can select the topic and then you start writing about it. But the themes that emerge implicitly are your subconscious having like its own little neuroses being like, you will talk about this whether you like it or not. And the reason I and many, many other writers I know can only distinguish, discern those themes by means of other good readers or other writers is because very often the most interesting, complicated themes that we've sort of suggested without realizing it are things we're uncomfortable with. So I need a reader. And so a theme that I had no idea would have emerged from my writing is the theme of labor. It's in so many essays. I did not realize I was obsessed with work. I did not realize before I started writing about carobs, and like the carob essay is largely about work and how work intersects with gender, and how like the expression of labor is related to femininity and masculinity in my experience of gender. Had no idea. I found that out by close reading.
Pointed out to you okay, wow.
It wasn't pointed out. I figured it out by like, I set up my essays and I read them thinking about themes. I can't remember if it was pointed out to me, but at least like when I discovered that so many of my essays had this obsession with labor and how it intersects with gender, I told somebody and they were like, yeah, obviously. And I was like, I had no idea.
And you're like, no, but I just figured it out. It's a big deal. So I think one of the things that I would imagine as a nonfiction writer can be a way of costuming or a way of presenting yourself, but also, can be very nerve-wracking would be the fact that, in your stories, you are essentially the main character of your essays. How do you approach writing with that sort of knowledge? Is it something that you have to kind of overcome? Do you cast yourself in different ways so that you can be analytical? Like, what's that process like for you?
It comes out through voice fairly organically, and it's not something that I think this surprises people. I get this question a lot, and it surprises people because you would think that I would be concerned with being exposed, but somehow I'm not. I feel it's a relief. And I have a lot of control over what I say and what I don't say. And an anecdote is actually from our MFA years. Mike Pearson, my advisor, said that I would need to sort of respond to a question in my thesis defense that never came, but why don't I write about my mother? Oh my God, my therapist said that asking a writer why she doesn't write about her mother is like asking a woman why she doesn't get an epidural, why she gets an epidural rather than feeling all the pain. That was the first comparison my therapist.
I'm so glad you're in my life.
However, going back to what we said earlier about how our like subconscious will like, excuse me, I would like to deal with this. I was in fiction workshop. I think you were actually in that workshop. I wrote a mother-daughter story.
Okay.
And I was sort of typing along, it's not me. And I'm like, ah!
Was it you, Joanna?
And so my experience is that in nonfiction, I feel very poised. I feel very in control. I'm going to deal with the issues I'm ready to deal with. Whereas apparently in fiction, and I've stopped writing fiction perhaps because I'm less in control or I'm less familiar with the genre. I'm like starting to write fiction and I'm like, all of my really difficult neuroses that I'm not prepared yet emotionally to deal with creep in. So I don't write fiction.
Neuroses are, by reputation, very ill-behaved, but especially when you write. It's just like, I did not want to touch that today. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just rude. It's not fair. And just a reminder, if anybody has questions, what I'm enjoying too about our conversation is that we can talk about, thematic issues, or we can talk about, the essay that you've read and, ideas that you're kind of percolating with, but also that we can talk about process, because I think that it's a really exciting thing. I've known you for like 14 years at this point. And so I know how long you worked on some of these essays, so to see them in a book, I'm like, she did it. But we have all been students, you and I both, went through school programs and the MFA program, learning all of these things. So I guess maybe, what would you say is one of the hardest lessons that you had to learn in your writing life? That's, not putting you on the spot too much.
Yeah, let me think of some lessons. Yeah, I often find myself kind of easing myself into an answer here. I often find myself frustrated at myself for knowing things now and not having known them earlier. I don't know if this happens to you.
All the time. Yeah.
I'm like, well, this was so easy. Or for another event, I opened up earlier documents, earlier drafts of the book. And I was like, what was I thinking? And actually for my process, I I actually had a list, including the point, what was I thinking? Because we go through so much not knowing. A lot of what I've learned really has been about persistence. I feel like this is going to sound a little big-headed, but like sometimes the world just isn't ready for you. There's a lot of politics. I got like in workshop, I would get a lot of like, all the politics is like hard to get through, or like, why are you, especially in undergrad in the 90s, right? People honestly thought I was weird for caring about politics, for caring about the world outside America. And like, yeah, this sounds a little arrogant, but sometimes you just keep doing what you're doing and then the world is ready for you.
Yeah. But I think, I think that that's a good, there's being receptive to criticism, and there's being receptive to people, having questions. But I think that usually, and I mean, maybe you can attest to this as well, passion for your subject, passion for your craft is going to be the thing that wins out, not, oh, well, people don't get this, so I'm going to just write this other thing that people seem to feel like is more palatable. Because it's not you.
And something that I've gotten a lot better at, and I feel like I should have learned it faster, but I didn't, is figuring out how to guide a reader that is not through so much unfamiliar material. Obviously, that was really difficult to understand and get my brain into the habit of recognizing, okay, like I have all this information I want to give to them. I can't info dump, like, and being resentful. Like I started out obviously as resentful of readers who didn't want to just read everything, and recognizing, okay, give, a little bit of narrative and then move them along and then keep up the momentum, and recognizing, okay, now here's a little information, and balancing that has been really slow. But now that I'm so much better at it and I actually have the skill, things are so much easier. And I'm like, why couldn't I have learned this faster?
I mean, it's like the mantra of our lives. I think, before the event started, we were talking a little bit about hospitality. And one of the things that you said, as far as like guiding the reader through, I wonder, what do you see your role as the writer, as the crafter of this essay that is being presented to a reader? What do you see your role as?
I feel like my persona does evolve over the course of writing. I think I'm a little more defensive sometimes in earlier drafts. I have an essay, I'm working on one that isn't working at all now. And I'm very sort of cheeky and distanced and like keeping the reader at bay. And I like don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to fix the fact that my narrative voice is so, it's just defensive. I'm writing about an issue that I'm really uncomfortable talking about, but it won't get out of my head. So I have to do it. So I guess I have to like keep working on it until I like break. Like you have to sort of break yourself into it and like I have to get past my defensiveness and sort of access the deeper emotions that I'm avoiding. And I guess in that way, I'm kind of almost like, oh shoot, what a weird analogy to answer your question, but I think it's kind of apt. Okay, so there are these, I've never taken drugs, but I've heard that when people take drugs, sometimes it's better to have like a person guiding you, like on a trip, like taking, what is it? A drug called ayahuasca. This is a weird answer to your question, but this is what happens.
Okay.
Like,
Yeah,
we want to
roll with it. Yeah.
I've never taken drugs, but I've heard a lot about them. And and I've heard specifically about ayahuasca and other sort of drugs that cause hallucinations. And like you need a person there to kind of hold your hand and allow you to get in touch with the things that are really painful. And that's what I imagine myself as. It's like I perform the emotional labor of accessing my pain, loss, fear, especially grief, resentment, understanding of myself, acceptance, self-acceptance is a big one, right? So I do that. And then the readers go through, like, I love when readers cry at my readings. I'm like, messed up mascara is the biggest compliment for me. So given that for me, the greatest triumph is having people bawling, what my role is that I'm sort of holding their hand and giving them a text that allows them to access that pain and lets them sort of release their own grief and access joy. Like, I think that I help readers process grief and loss, anxiety and fear by telling my story, and my story allows them to really process and fully feel their own loss. And so I'm sort of guiding them along a quasi hallucinatory journey.
Very good. So I would love to hear from participants in the webinar who have read the book and who might have things that they want to say about it. Maybe Susan can help with that.
Sure. If you're attending the webinar and you'd like to say something, I think you have the option to raise your hand and then I can unmute you and you can speak. Or you can put it in the chat if you'd prefer.
Hi, I'm trying to figure this out here. Let's see. I wanted to tell you, I read your book in 3 nights, stayed up late, found so many commonalities. For example, shame, maybe not from you, but from being like the perfect little girl, Catholic, Roman, engaged, date set. I found out I was pregnant, and the priest told me to lie to my parents because it would break them totally apart. So, I mean, it was, you're the Greek Orthodox, you've done well, you've been good. There's a discrepancy in society, and not a discrimination in society about what love is. And then therefore, the part I laughed was when your mother, I think she thought it was hormones or there were parts that were funny. So what I'm trying to say is you're connecting on one side and one issue of a difficult time, but then it's a much broader reach that you actually attained by writing. I went to WVU for grad. I got my PhD at ODU. However, the way this book, the book is set up with those little, like, I don't know what to call them, like little flowers in between. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, section break. I would just call them section breaks. Thank you.
It's very well done. I'm on the board of the Muse, and I know we'd love to have essayists. I don't believe we've had, at least in the 8 years I've been there, I don't remember anyone really focusing on essays. And I found it so good that they're standalone and a semi-memoir. So I just want to tell you, 3-day read is a quick read. It means it's very good. I'm learning, and I'm able to send it out to my reader friends. So good for you.
That means so much, Carol. Thank you so much.
Good for you. No, the thanks goes to you. Again, my dad was 3 years an American, then back to Poland, volunteered for France. He was going to be a priest. So I have some of the similar backgrounds where, everything you had to be absolutely perfect, absolutely the best. But at any rate, prisoner of war in Germany for 5 years. I heard that Greek is one of the most difficult languages to learn. Amy Breyer wrote the book, The Close. She's a minister, Stephen Bryan's daughter. And they made the point that it was one of the most arduous journeys anybody could take to learn Greek. So the fact that you were able to, so when you left America and then you went to Cyprus and you were in school, you didn't know how to speak Greek, correct?
I knew a little bit because I took it in school, but actually I used to, something that's not in the book is I cried so much because I would get A's really easily in all the subjects, but I wasn't so good at Greek just because my parents didn't speak it at home, whereas a lot of the other immigrants. So I worked really hard. Thank you so much, Carol. That's really meaningful because it means that I took a very long time to write this book, but I think part of the process was layering in enough meaning so that it reaches so many different people. And I think the essay that you're referring to is called Unsent Letter to My Father, and friends of ours have assigned that, and I would be honored to teach at the Muse and maybe give that as an assignment. I'm planning on waiting until I get tenure, God willing, at Christopher Newport, and then that's my sort of focus right now, but I would be honored to teach at the Muse as soon as I become an associate professor, God willing. I would love to participate in this really important work that the Muse does, because I honestly believe that writing is something that people can do not only to express themselves, but as Dana and I discussed earlier, to connect with others and to feel like they're not alone.
Yeah, one thing that Carol, your comments about how you were able to see parts of yourself through Joanna's stories. One of the things that we talk about that's very, lingo with writers is the universal paradox, where by writing about something very specific and very personal on a micro level, we get at something that's so much bigger and that really feels universal. So that Joanna telling her own individual stories and going, really specific on that, she's able to appeal to the experiences that people have had in their own lives, even if they are completely disparate. And I think that's something, Joanna, that you do really, really well. Joanna, is there anything that you want to leave off with?
I think where we left off, where we arrived, and Carol's beautiful comments. Oh, I do want to thank Carol for mentioning that she read it so quickly, because I know it's fairly dense. It's a tribute to your mind. I know that it's fairly dense, and it means that one of my answers to Dana's question was that I worked really hard to figure out how to insert the information gradually so that readers didn't feel like they had to stick it all in their heads and go. So I just feel so honored that Carol assured me that I did it. I did it. And I think tonight's event really, by focusing on joy and by having a reader commenting live and talking about how her very different experiences were mirrored through a book about an island so far away, we saw the great gift to one another that writing has to offer. And Dana offered me a gift by being such an attentive reader and asking such beautiful questions that prompted me and permitted me to think about things in new ways, even though I've been working on this book for over 15 years.
Well, that is my pleasure. And it has been such a pleasure getting to talk to you and ask you questions and, suss out all of this. So, and this was a blast for me. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And for those coming to us in the future, hello. And thank you for being here as well. Susan, is there, I know I'm cheesing it up right at the end. Susan, is there anything that we should leave off with?
Well, I'll cheese it up a bit too, but genuinely, thank you both so much for such a beautiful conversation. Carol, thank you for sharing with us as well. If you're watching on Zoom, there's a link to the book if you haven't read it yet. And I'll also put, Joanna, we would love to have you at the Muse, so tell CNU to get on it with tenure. I'll put a link to the Muse website as well. We've got a few other events coming up, so be sure to check that out. And thank you to everyone who is watching live in the webinar. Thank you to everyone who's watching on Facebook and everyone who's watching in the future. And especially thank you to Dana and Joanna for such a lovely evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.